September 1440. The dungeons of Nantes Castle held a prisoner who, just 11 years earlier, had been celebrated as one of France's greatest heroes. Gilles de Rais, Baron of Brittany, Marshal of France, the man who had fought alongside Joan of Arc herself at the Siege of Orléans, now sat in chains awaiting trial. But this wasn't a trial for the crime that had gotten him arrested. That was just a property dispute, a nobleman's arrogance taken too far when he kidnapped a clergyman named Jean Le Ferrand over a land disagreement. Embarrassing, certainly. Criminal, yes. But hardly worth the attention that was now being directed at the former Marshal of France. At 25, Gilles had stood at the pinnacle of French nobility. While most young nobles were still proving themselves in minor skirmishes, he had been entrusted with commanding troops alongside the Maid of Orléans during France's darkest hour. Contemporary chronicles describe him leading cavalry charges, his banner flying beside Joan's as they broke the English siege. King Charles VII himself had elevated Gilles to Marshal of France in 1429, an honor reserved for the realm's most distinguished military commanders. The young baron seemed destined for a legendary career, wealth beyond measure already his through inheritance, and glory earned through valor on the battlefield. But Joan's capture in 1430 and subsequent execution in 1431 marked the beginning of Gilles's withdrawal from military life. He returned to his estates, to his vast inherited fortune, and began spending with a recklessness that alarmed even his own family. Palace records show expenditures that would make modern billionaires blush. He maintained a private chapel with a choir that rivaled the king's own, commissioned elaborate theatrical performances that could cost as much as a small military campaign, and kept a household staff of over 200 servants. His family, watching their ancestral wealth evaporate, attempted to legally restrict his ability to sell properties. Court documents from 1435 show his relatives petitioning the king to prevent Gilles from liquidating more of the family estates. Then came 1437, and the incident that would prove fatal to whatever remained of Gilles' political protection. In a dispute over church property, Gilles didn't use lawyers or appeals to higher authority. He sent armed men to physically abduct Jean Le Ferrand, a priest, from his own church. He held the clergyman prisoner until the property dispute was resolved in his favor. For a medieval nobleman, this wasn't unprecedented behavior. The powerful often took what they wanted. But Gilles had made a critical miscalculation. He had assaulted a member of the clergy, giving the church itself grounds to move against him. And he had done so while already politically isolated, his military career over, his family alienated by his spending, his former protectors at court either dead or indifferent. Jean V, Duke of Brittany, had been watching Gilles' decline with interest. The Duke had his own reasons for wanting Gilles removed from power. The de Rais estates bordered ducal territories, and several of Gilles' properties had been targets of ducal acquisition attempts. With Gilles now vulnerable, politically friendless, and having committed a crime against the church, the Duke had his opportunity. In May 1440, he authorized an official investigation into the Baron of Rais. Initially, the investigation focused on the kidnapping of Le Ferrand, standard procedure for a nobleman who had overstepped. But then something extraordinary happened. The investigation began expanding in scope, directed by Jean de Malestroit, the Bishop of Nantes, working in coordination with the Duke's secular courts. By August, rumors were spreading through Brittany. Whispers of children disappearing near Gilles' properties. Stories of parents who had sent their sons to serve in the Baron's household, only to have them vanish without explanation. Each rumor seemed to lead to another, and the investigation's focus shifted from property crime to something far darker. On September 13, 1440, Gilles de Rais was formally arrested. The official charges hadn't been filed yet, but already the machinery of medieval justice was beginning to turn. Two parallel investigations were launched, one secular court headed by Pierre de l'Hôpital for the Duke of Brittany, and one ecclesiastical court headed by Bishop Malestroit. This dual prosecution was unusual, suggesting coordination at the highest levels. What began as a case of aristocratic overreach was about to become something unprecedented. Within weeks, The former hero of Orléans would face accusations so monstrous that they would overshadow Joan of Arc's own trial, accusations that would transform Gilles de Rais from a reckless nobleman into the most reviled figure in Christendom. But here's what makes this case so disturbing. Not just the accusations themselves, but how perfectly they would serve the interests of everyone who wanted Gilles destroyed. The stage was set. The courts were ready. All they needed now were the right testimonies. And medieval justice had very efficient methods for obtaining exactly the testimonies it required. The medieval justice system had a peculiar feature that modern observers often miss. Criminal investigations didn't work backward from evidence to suspect. They worked forward from suspect to evidence. Once someone powerful decided you were guilty, the investigation's job was simply to produce the documentation that would justify the predetermined verdict. And in 1440, Brittany, two very powerful institutions had decided that Gilles de Rais needed to be found guilty of something significant enough to justify permanent removal from power and, ideally, confiscation of his remaining estates. Bishop Jean de Malestroit's ecclesiastical investigation and Duke Jeanville's secular prosecution began with a critical strategic decision. They wouldn't pursue Gilles merely for the kidnapping of Jean Le Ferron. That crime, while serious, would result in fines, perhaps temporary imprisonment, but nothing that would permanently eliminate Gilles as a political entity. Instead, they would pursue charges of heresy, sorcery, and crimes against nature. These charges carried the death penalty, allowed for confiscation of all property, and most importantly, gave investigators access to special interrogation procedures normally reserved for enemies of the faith. The investigation's first targets weren't Gilles himself, but his servants. Medieval households operated on strict hierarchies, and a nobleman like Gilles would have had dozens of attendants, pages, grooms, and personal servants who handled his daily affairs. Two men in particular became the focus of the investigators' attention: Henriette Griard, also known as Henriette, and Étienne Corriot, called Poitou. Both were personal servants who had been in Gilles' employ for years, who had traveled with him between his various estates, who had access to the private areas of his residences. Court records from September 1440 show that Henriette and Poitou were arrested and placed in separate cells. The interrogation of servants followed established procedures that had been refined over decades of heresy trials. The process was methodical, almost bureaucratic in its efficiency. First came the formal accusation, vague enough to be impossible to disprove. Then came the invitation to confess voluntarily, with promises of mercy for cooperation. When voluntary confession failed to materialize, as it almost always did, came the escalation. Medieval torture wasn't the chaotic brutality that popular imagination suggests. It was a carefully regulated legal procedure with specific rules about what could be done, to whom, and under what circumstances. The Church, in particular, had detailed guidelines. Torture could only be applied after sufficient evidence suggested guilt. It couldn't cause permanent injury or death. And most importantly, any confession obtained under torture had to be repeated voluntarily afterward to be valid in court. These rules created a perverse system where investigators would torture someone until they confessed, then release them from torture and ask them to repeat the confession freely, with the implicit understanding that refusal would result in more torture. What Henriette and Poitou confessed to, under circumstances that court documents carefully describe as proper legal procedure, was extraordinary in its detail. They described a pattern of crimes stretching back years. Children, they said, mostly boys between the ages of 6 and 18, had been brought to Gilles's various residences. Some were peasant children whose parents had been told their sons would receive education or employment in the baron's household. Others were children of minor nobility, sent to serve as pages. The confessions alleged that these children were taken to private chambers, sexually assaulted, murdered, and their bodies dismembered and burned to destroy evidence. The numbers grew with each interrogation session. Initially, Henriette spoke of a handful of victims. As the investigation continued, the count expanded: 10 children, 20, 50. By the time the formal indictment was drawn up, the accusers would claim that Gilles de Rais had murdered over 140 children across his various estates. The confessions included specific details, names of some victims, descriptions of methods, even the layout of rooms where the alleged crimes occurred. They described how bodies were disposed of, claiming that remains were burned in massive fireplaces, buried in castle grounds, or thrown into castle latrines. But here's where the case becomes deeply problematic for any modern analysis. These confessions followed a pattern. They weren't random or chaotic. They aligned almost perfectly with the formula of contemporary heresy accusations. Medieval prosecutors had, by 1440, developed a standard narrative for crimes involving sorcery and demonic pacts. The accusations against Gilles hit every single checkbox. Sexual deviance? Check. Murder of innocents? Check. Desecration of Christian symbols? Check. Invocation of demons? Check. The confessions read like they were copied from a template because in a sense they were. The investigation also brought in another figure who would play a crucial role in the developing case. Francesco Prelati, an Italian cleric who had been in Gilles' employ as an alchemist and advisor on occult matters. The historical record confirms that Gilles, like many wealthy nobles of his era, had become fascinated with alchemy and ceremonial magic. This wasn't unusual. The line between proto-chemistry and sorcery was blurry in the 15th century, and many educated people dabbled in what we would now call occult studies. But in the context of a heresy investigation, Gilles' interest in alchemy became evidence of demonic pacts. Prelati, faced with his own arrest and interrogation, provided testimony that aligned conveniently with the prosecution's needs. He described elaborate rituals, ceremonies designed to summon demons, promises of wealth and power in exchange for innocent blood. His testimony added the supernatural element that transformed the case from mere criminality into cosmic evil. Gilles wasn't just a murderer. He was a servant of Satan himself, practicing ritual sacrifice as part of a demonic pact. The investigation's expansion was remarkably efficient. Within weeks, prosecutors had assembled a case that touched on every crime the medieval mind could conceive of. Sodomy, murder, heresy, apostasy, sacrilege, and demon worship. Each charge reinforced the others, creating a narrative so comprehensive, so perfectly aligned with contemporary fears about supernatural evil that it became almost impossible to question. But throughout this entire process, one critical element was missing: physical evidence. Despite claims of 140 murdered children, despite descriptions of burial sites and disposal methods, not a single body was ever produced in court. Not one bone, not one piece of physical evidence that a crime had actually occurred. The prosecution's response to this absence was telling. They didn't need bodies, they had confessions, extracted using legally sanctioned methods from servants who had every reason to say whatever their interrogators wanted to hear, and they had one more target left to break: Gilles de Rais himself. The former Marshal of France was about to face the full force of medieval judicial procedure. And once that process began, once the machinery of torture and spiritual coercion was directed at him, everyone watching knew there was only one possible outcome. To understand what happened to Henriette Griard and Etienne Correau in those interrogation chambers, you need to understand how medieval torture functioned as a legal technology. This wasn't random violence. It was a systematic method for producing confessions that courts would accept as valid evidence. The process had rules, procedures, and a twisted internal logic that made it remarkably effective at generating exactly the testimony prosecutors needed. The standard toolkit of 15th century judicial torture included several devices, each with specific applications. The strappado involved tying the victim's hands behind their back, attaching the bindings to a pulley, and hoisting them off the ground. The victim's own body weight would dislocate their shoulders. Weights could be added to their feet to increase the pain. The rack stretched the body until joints separated. Thumb screws and leg screws applied crushing pressure to bones. And these were just the officially sanctioned methods, the ones that left documentation in court records because they were considered legitimate legal procedure. But here's what made the system particularly insidious. Medieval torture wasn't primarily about physical pain. It was about creating a psychological state where confession seemed like the only escape from an unbearable situation. Interrogators would show victims the instruments, Explain in detail what each device would do to their body, and then offer a simple choice. Confess now, voluntarily, or confess later after experiencing unimaginable agony. Most people, faced with that choice, chose to confess immediately. The torture became almost unnecessary once the threat was established. Court records from Gilles de Rais's trial show that Henriette and Poitou were interrogated multiple times between their arrest in mid-September and the formal indictment on October 8th. The documents use careful language. They were questioned, examined, and invited to tell the truth. But the progression of their statements reveals the classic pattern of coerced confession. Initial statements were vague and limited. Subsequent statements became increasingly detailed and aligned perfectly with what the prosecution needed to hear. Henriette's confessions, extracted over multiple sessions, described a system of murder that had supposedly operated for years without detection. He claimed that children would be brought to various de Rais residences under false pretenses. Parents were told their sons would receive education, employment, or positions as pages in a noble household. Once inside the castle walls, Henriette alleged, these children would be taken to private chambers, where Gilles would sexually assault and murder them. The bodies, according to these confessions, were then dismembered, burned in large fireplaces, or buried in remote parts of the castle grounds. Poitou's confessions matched Henriette's with suspicious precision. He described the same locations, the same methods, even used similar phrases to describe events. Both servants claimed they had participated reluctantly, forced by their master's commands and threats. Both expressed remorse and begged for mercy. And both provided exactly the kind of detailed, horrifying testimony that would make Gilles' guilt seem undeniable. The confessions read like coordinated scripts, which in a sense they were. Medieval interrogators knew what story they needed, and they extracted that story with methodical efficiency. But here's where the case reveals its fundamental weakness. The confessions described disposal methods that should have left evidence. Bodies burned in fireplaces would leave bone fragments that couldn't be completely destroyed by medieval fire temperatures. Burials in castle grounds could be excavated. Even bodies thrown into latrines would leave traces. Yet when the formal charges were presented on October 8, 1440, not a single piece of physical evidence was included. The entire case rested on confessions extracted from servants under torture, and on the testimony of Francesco Prelati, who had his own reasons to cooperate with prosecutors. The indictment itself is a remarkable document. It lists 47 separate charges, grouped into categories of heresy, sodomy, and murder. The language is formulaic, following patterns established in earlier heresy trials. Gilles is accused of invoking demons, making pacts with evil spirits, sacrificing innocent children to Satan, and committing acts contrary to nature. Each charge includes references to testimony from Henriette, Poitou, or Prelati. Each charge follows the standard template of medieval satanic accusations. The document reads less like a criminal indictment and more like a propaganda piece designed to justify a predetermined conclusion. What's particularly striking is how the confessions incorporated elements that had nothing to do with the original investigation. Remember, Gilles was arrested for kidnapping a priest. That's a property and political crime. But the confessions transformed him into a practitioner of ritual Satanism, complete with ceremonies designed to summon demons like Baron, Satan, and Belial. Prelati's testimony described elaborate rituals where Gilles allegedly offered children's blood and body parts to demons in exchange for wealth and power. These weren't details that emerged organically from an investigation into missing children. These were elements inserted because they fit the narrative prosecutors wanted to construct. Medieval audiences understood demon worship as the ultimate crime, worse than murder, because it threatened not just individual lives, but cosmic order itself. A murderer killed bodies. A Satanist endangered souls. By framing Gilles as a demon worshipper, prosecutors ensured that questioning the charges would seem like defending evil itself. The accusations became unquestionable not because they were proven, but because questioning them required defending the indefensible. The servants' confessions also included details designed to explain away the lack of physical evidence. Bodies were completely burned to ash. Burial sites were in areas that had since been disturbed by construction. Remains were thrown into waterways and washed away. Every potential piece of evidence had a ready explanation for why it no longer existed. This is a classic pattern in coerced confessions. The narrative expands to accommodate contradictions, creating explanations for why physical proof is unavailable while maintaining that the crimes absolutely occurred. But medieval courts didn't require physical evidence when they had confessions. Church law specifically stated that the testimony of 2 witnesses, even if obtained under torture, was sufficient for conviction in heresy cases. Henriette and Poitou, having confessed, counted as witnesses. Their statements, corroborated by Prelati's testimony about satanic rituals, created a legal sufficiency that made physical evidence unnecessary. The system was designed to produce convictions based on testimony alone, and it was working exactly as intended. What happened in those interrogation chambers between September 13th and October 8th remains partially obscured by the careful language of official records. Court documents don't explicitly describe torture being applied. They describe questions and examinations. But the results speak clearly. 2 men who initially claimed innocence eventually confessed to being accomplices in over 100 murders. They provided detailed testimony that perfectly aligned with prosecution theories. And they did so, knowing that their confessions would result in their own executions. People don't typically confess to capital crimes unless the alternative seems even worse. By early October 1440, the prosecution had assembled a case that seemed overwhelming. Multiple witnesses, detailed confessions, charges that touched every aspect of medieval criminality from sexual deviance to demonic heresy. All that remained was to break the main target. Gilles de Rais had watched his servants arrested and interrogated. He knew what methods had been used. He knew what they had confessed to. And he knew that those same methods would soon be directed at him. The former Marshal of France, who had faced English armies at Orléans without flinching, was about to face something far more terrifying. The machinery of medieval justice, operating at full efficiency, with his destruction as its only goal. October 8th, 1440. Gilles de Rais stood before 2 tribunals simultaneously, a feat of judicial coordination that revealed just how thoroughly his enemies had prepared. On one side sat the ecclesiastical court, headed by Bishop Jean de Malestroit, with authority over charges of heresy and crimes against the Church. On the other sat the secular court, presided over by Pierre de l'Hôpital, with jurisdiction over civil crimes like murder and assault. Both courts had identical goals: extract a confession from Gilles that would justify his execution and the confiscation of his properties. The formal indictment was read aloud, 47 charges that painted Gilles as a monster beyond comprehension. But the initial proceedings didn't go as planned. When asked to respond to the charges, Gilles refused, not with denials or explanations, but with silence and contempt. Contemporary accounts describe him interrupting the reading of charges, insulting the judges, and declaring that he would not dignify such ridiculous accusations with responses. This was the behavior of a man who still thought his noble status would protect him, who believed that the entire proceeding was political theater that would ultimately be resolved through backroom negotiations. He was catastrophically wrong. Medieval courts had dealt with recalcitrant nobles before, and they had developed specific procedures for breaking aristocratic defiance. The first weapon was spiritual rather than physical, the threat of excommunication. On October 13th, Bishop Malestroit declared that if Gilles continued to refuse cooperation with the ecclesiastical court, he would be excommunicated. This wasn't merely a symbolic gesture. Excommunication meant damnation, eternal separation from God's grace, condemnation to hell. For a medieval Catholic, this was a terror that transcended any physical threat. But Gilles continued to resist, perhaps believing the Church wouldn't actually follow through, or perhaps calculating that excommunication was preferable to confession. On October 14th, The bishop made good on his threat. Gilles de Rais was formally excommunicated, declared outside the protection of the church, his soul condemned unless he repented and cooperated. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Court records note that Gilles, who had been defiant and contemptuous just hours earlier, broke down completely. He threw himself at the bishop's feet, begging for forgiveness, promising full cooperation if only his excommunication would be lifted. The court's response demonstrated the calculated brutality of medieval judicial procedure. They agreed to lift the excommunication on one condition. Gilles must confess fully and completely to all charges. He must provide details, names, locations. He must hold nothing back, and he must do so voluntarily, without torture being applied, so the confession would be legally valid. Faced with the choice between eternal damnation and confession, Gilles chose confession. What happened next, on October 15th, remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case. Gilles de Rais, former Marshal of France, hero of Orléans, nobleman of one of the greatest families in Brittany, confessed to everything. Not just some of the charges, not just the plausible accusations, but every single horrific detail that Henriette, Poitou, and Prelati had described. The confession lasted hours, with Gilles providing elaborately detailed accounts of murders, sexual assaults, and satanic rituals. The confession hit every single point the prosecution needed. Gilles admitted to killing children, claiming he had done so for sexual gratification and as part of demonic rituals. He described invoking demons by name: Baron, Satan, Belial. He claimed he had made pacts with these entities, offering innocent blood in exchange for wealth and power. He expressed remorse, begging God's forgiveness and asking for death as just punishment for his crimes. The confession was so perfectly aligned with medieval demonology that it reads like a textbook example of satanic heresy. But here's what's deeply suspicious about this confession. It came from a man who had just spent several days under threat of excommunication, knowing that continued resistance would condemn his eternal soul. It emerged after weeks of watching his servants tortured into confessing, and it followed exactly the formula of dozens of other heresy confessions from the same period. The language Gilles used, the structure of his admissions, even the specific demons he claimed to have invoked, all of it matched templates established in earlier trials. Modern psychological research on false confessions reveals patterns that map eerily onto what happened to Gilles. When people are placed under extreme psychological pressure, when they're offered a choice between immediate relief and continued suffering, when they're told that confession is the only path to salvation, they will confess to almost anything. The medieval church had discovered this centuries before modern psychology documented it. They had refined the process into a science of soul-breaking that was remarkably effective at producing confessions regardless of actual guilt. The ecclesiastical court, having obtained Gilles' confession, immediately lifted his excommunication and restored him to the church's grace. This itself is revealing. If Gilles had truly committed the crimes he confessed to, satanic rituals and demon worship and the murder of over 100 children, would the church have so quickly welcomed him back? Or was his excommunication and restoration simply a tool to extract the testimony they needed? On October 21st, Gilles was brought before the courts again, this time without any torture or threat of excommunication hanging over him. The purpose of this session was to have him repeat his confession freely, as required by law for confessions to be valid. Medieval legal procedure recognized that confessions obtained under duress might not be trustworthy, so they required that accused persons voluntarily reaffirm their statements. But this safeguard was largely theatrical. Gilles knew that denying his previous confession would result in immediate return to excommunication, further torture, and the same cycle repeating until he confessed again. So he confirmed everything. He repeated the confessions in full, adding even more details. He named additional victims. He described additional rituals. He painted himself as a monster so depraved that his execution would be not just justified, but necessary for the protection of all Christendom. and the courts accepted this repetition as proof that his confession was voluntary and legitimate. The legal requirements had been satisfied. Gilles de Rais had convicted himself with his own words. But there's a moment in the October 21st proceedings that reveals something crucial about Gilles' state of mind. Court transcripts record him making statements that seem almost designed to ensure his execution. He didn't just confess to the specific charges. He elaborated on them, made them worse, added flourishes that weren't in the original indictment. This is the behavior of someone who has been completely broken psychologically, someone who has accepted that death is inevitable, and is now trying to die in a way that might save his soul. Medieval theology taught that true repentance, even for the most horrific sins, could lead to salvation. A confessed sinner who truly repented might still enter heaven after appropriate penance and suffering. But an unrepentant sinner who died in a state of mortal sin would be damned eternally. Gilles, faced with inevitable execution, chose the path that medieval theology offered: confess everything, express absolute remorse, accept death as just punishment, and hope for God's mercy. He was playing the only card he had left, trying to die as a penitent sinner rather than a defiant heretic. The content of his confessions is worth examining closely because it reveals how perfectly they align with prosecution needs. Gilles claimed he had killed children in every way imaginable: strangulation, throat-cutting, beheading, dismemberment. He said he had sexually assaulted victims before and after death. He described disposing of bodies in fireplaces, latrines, and burial pits. He claimed to have invoked demons using rituals that required innocent blood. Every detail served to make him appear more monstrous, more deserving of death, and more aligned with the standard template of satanic heresy. What's missing from these confessions is equally revealing. Gilles never named accomplices beyond those already arrested. He never implicated other nobles who might have participated or known about his alleged crimes. He never mentioned specific merchants who sold him materials for rituals, or priests who might have been corrupted. A genuine confession of crimes this extensive, carried out over years, would necessarily implicate a network of accomplices and enablers. But Gilles' confession was conveniently self-contained, implicating only himself and the servants who had already confessed. By October 22nd, both courts had what they needed: a full confession, voluntarily repeated, that covered every charge in the indictment. The secular court found Gilles guilty of murder and crimes against nature. The ecclesiastical court found him guilty of heresy, apostasy, and invocation of demons. Both courts sentenced him to death. The coordination was perfect. The legal requirements had been satisfied. The machinery of medieval justice had produced exactly the outcome that the Duke of Brittany and the Bishop of Nantes had wanted from the beginning. Henriette Griart and Etienne Corillo, the servants whose tortured confessions had begun this entire process, were also sentenced to death. They would be hanged and burned alongside their master, their reward for cooperating with the investigation. Francesco Prelati, the Italian cleric whose testimony about satanic rituals had provided crucial support for the heresy charges, was imprisoned but eventually released. The differential treatment is instructive. Those who could implicate Gilles were executed, ensuring they could never recant their testimonies. But Prelati, who remained useful to the prosecution, was allowed to survive. The sentence was scheduled for October 26, 1440. Gilles de Rais had less than 4 days to live. But before his execution, there would be one final act in this judicial theatre, one that would cement his legend and create mysteries that historians would debate for the next 6 centuries. The former Marshal of France, broken and confessed, was about to face his death, and the manner of his dying would raise questions about whether he was truly a monster or something else entirely. Between October 22nd and October 26th, 1440, something remarkable happened in the coordination between two supposedly independent judicial systems. The ecclesiastical court, under Bishop Jean de Malestroit, and the secular court, under Pierre de l'Hôpital, arrived at perfectly synchronized verdicts with perfectly coordinated sentences. This level of cooperation between church and state wasn't unusual in high-profile heresy cases. But the precision of the coordination in Gilles' case reveals just how thoroughly orchestrated the entire proceeding had been from the start. The ecclesiastical court's verdict came first. On October 25th, Bishop Malestroit declared Gilles guilty of heresy, apostasy, invocation of demons, and violation of ecclesiastical immunity. The sentence was excommunication, followed by delivery to secular authorities for execution. This was standard procedure in heresy cases. The Church didn't technically execute heretics. Instead, it declared them guilty of spiritual crimes, excommunicated them, and then handed them over to secular courts, with the understanding that execution would follow. This legal fiction allowed the Church to maintain that it didn't shed blood, while ensuring that heretics were killed. The secular court's verdict, delivered the same day, found Gilles guilty of multiple counts of murder, sodomy, and crimes against nature. The sentence was death by hanging, followed by burning of the body. But here's where the coordination becomes most visible. The secular court specifically ruled that Gilles' body would be allowed Christian burial after execution, despite him being a confessed heretic. This was extraordinary. Heretics were typically burned completely, their ashes scattered to prevent any veneration of remains. But in Gilles' case, the court ruled that his profound repentance and complete confession warranted mercy. Why would the courts show this mercy to a man they had just declared to be one of the most depraved criminals in Christendom? The answer lies in the political calculation behind the entire trial. Gilles had confessed fully and voluntarily, according to the legal record. He had implicated no other nobles or powerful figures. He had provided the perfect narrative of a lone monster brought to justice. And most importantly, his execution would clear the way for confiscation of his properties without creating martyrs or ongoing legal complications. The property aspect cannot be overstated. Medieval law held that convicted heretics forfeited all property to the crown, or in this case, to the Duke of Brittany. Gilles' remaining estates, despite his years of extravagant spending, were still substantial. Court records show that within months of his execution, several of his properties had been transferred to the ducal administration or sold to nobles allied with Duke Jean V. The financial benefit of Gilles' conviction was immediate and significant. But the trial served other purposes beyond simple property confiscation. It demonstrated the reach of ducal and ecclesiastical authority. It showed that even the highest nobles were subject to justice when they stepped outside political protection. And it provided a public spectacle that would reinforce social order and religious orthodoxy. Medieval executions weren't just punishments. They were theatrical performances designed to teach lessons about power, justice, and the consequences of transgression. The perfection of the coordination raises uncomfortable questions about the entire proceeding. How did two separate court systems, one religious and one secular, arrive at identical conclusions based solely on confessions extracted under psychological duress? How did they coordinate their sentences so precisely? And why did they show mercy regarding burial to a man they claimed had sacrificed over 140 children to demons? The most logical answer is that the trial's outcome was determined before it began, and the proceedings were simply a process of creating legal documentation to justify predetermined conclusions. Consider what the trial produced. Detailed confessions that followed standard heresy templates, testimony from servants who were subsequently executed, expert witness testimony from Francesco Prelati, who had every incentive to cooperate, and a defendant who confessed to everything after being threatened with eternal damnation. What the trial didn't produce: a single piece of physical evidence. No bodies, no bone fragments, no burial sites, no witnesses beyond those who were tortured or coerced, no independent verification of any claim. The absence of physical evidence was explained away through Gilles' own confessions. He had burned the bodies completely, destroyed all traces, operated in such secrecy that no one beyond his immediate servants knew what was happening. This created an unfalsifiable narrative. The lack of evidence became proof of how carefully the crimes had been concealed, rather than reason to question whether crimes had occurred at all. It was a prosecutorial masterpiece, a case built entirely on testimony that couldn't be contradicted, because there was nothing physical to contradict it with. The verdicts also served to legitimize the confessions. If Gilles was truly innocent, why would he confess? Medieval legal theory held that confessions were the highest form of proof precisely because no one would voluntarily admit to capital crimes unless they were actually guilty. The possibility that confessions could be coerced through psychological manipulation, that people would confess to avoid worse alternatives, that the entire system was designed to produce confessions regardless of truth, these concepts weren't part of medieval legal thinking. Or rather, they were understood but not acknowledged because the system depended on treating confessions as absolute proof. What happened to Gilles' properties after his execution tells us everything about the true motivations behind the trial. Within a year, most of his remaining estates had been redistributed. Some went to the Duke of Brittany directly. Others were sold to nobles who had supported the prosecution. His family, already impoverished by his spending, received nothing. The legal principle was clear. Heretics had no rights, and their property reverted to those who had brought them to justice. The trial had achieved its primary objective. A politically isolated, financially vulnerable nobleman had been removed, and his assets had been redistributed to more reliable hands. But the trial's legacy extended beyond simple property transfer. The case of Gilles de Rais established precedents that would be used in future prosecutions. It demonstrated how charges of satanic ritual could be used to destroy even the highest-ranking nobles. It showed how coordination between ecclesiastical and secular courts could produce legally unassailable convictions based entirely on coerced testimony. And it created a template that would be followed in witch trials for the next 3 centuries. The perfect coordination between the courts also reveals something about medieval power structures. Justice wasn't blind or neutral. It was a tool of political and ecclesiastical authority, used to maintain order and eliminate threats. The elaborate legal procedures, the careful documentation, the requirement for voluntary confessions, all of it created a veneer of legitimacy over what was fundamentally a political execution. Gilles de Rais was killed not because his guilt was proven beyond doubt, but because powerful people had decided he needed to be eliminated, and the legal system provided the mechanism to do so with an appearance of justice. On the evening of October 25th, with verdicts delivered and sentences pronounced, Gilles de Rais had less than 24 hours to live. He spent his final night in prayer, attended by confessors who documented his continued repentance. The church had gotten what it needed, a penitent heretic who validated the system by accepting his punishment. The Duke had gotten what he needed, legal cover for eliminating a troublesome noble and seizing valuable properties. The only question remaining was how Gilles himself would face his death. Would he recant at the last moment, creating a scandal that might undermine the carefully constructed narrative? Or would he maintain his confession to the end, dying as a monster who at least had the grace to admit his monstrosity? The execution was scheduled for midday on October 26th in a meadow called the Prairie de la Madeleine, just outside Nantes. Gallows had been erected, wood had been piled for burning, and crowds were already gathering to witness justice being done. Medieval executions attracted audiences numbering in the thousands, people who came to see the wicked punished and to hear final confessions that would reinforce moral and religious lessons. The execution of a Marshal of France, a former hero of Orléans, accused of crimes so heinous they seemed to come from hell itself, this would be a spectacle unlike any Nantes had seen in generations. But what happened at that execution would create mysteries that historians would debate for 600 years. The manner of Gilles' dying, his behavior in his final moments, the aftermath of his burial, all of it would raise questions about whether justice had truly been served or whether medieval politics had created one of history's most successful character assassinations. October 26th, 1440, midday. The Prairie de la Madeleine was packed with thousands of spectators who had come to witness the execution of Gilles de Rais. Medieval executions followed strict protocols designed to extract maximum moral and political value from the death of criminals. The condemned would be paraded before the crowd, their crimes would be read aloud, they would be given an opportunity to make a final statement, and then the sentence would be carried out. Every step was choreographed to reinforce lessons about sin, justice, and the power of authorities to punish transgression. Gilles was brought to the execution site alongside Henriette Griard and Etienne Corillot, the two servants whose confessions had been instrumental in his conviction. All three had been sentenced to death by hanging, followed by burning. But contemporary accounts of what happened next describe behavior that didn't fit the expected script. Condemned heretics typically faced death with terror or defiance. They screamed their innocence, cursed their accusers, or begged frantically for mercy that wouldn't come. Gilles de Rais did none of these things. Multiple chroniclers describe Gilles' demeanor as calm, penitent, and deeply religious. He reportedly prayed continuously, asked forgiveness from God and from the families of his alleged victims, and encouraged Henriette and Poitou to maintain their faith as they faced death. He spoke to the assembled crowd, urging parents to carefully guard their children and young men, to avoid the sins of pride and lust that had led to his downfall. His final words, according to court records, were prayers asking for God's mercy on his soul. This behavior was so unexpected that several chroniclers specifically commented on it. They described Gilles as appearing more like a martyr than a monster, more like a saint facing death than a satanic killer receiving just punishment. Some observers reported weeping at the sight of the former Marshal of France dying with such dignity and apparent sincere repentance. The execution was supposed to be a validation of the justice system, a demonstration that evil had been punished. Instead, it created sympathy for the condemned man. The execution itself followed the prescribed method. All three men were hanged until dead, their bodies then placed on pyres to be burned. But here's where something extraordinary occurred, something that had been prearranged but appeared spontaneous to the crowd. Before Gilles' body could be completely consumed by fire, several noble ladies, reportedly moved by his pious death, requested permission to remove his body from the flames for proper Christian burial. The executioners agreed, and Gilles' partially burned corpse was taken to the Carmelite church in Nantes for burial in consecrated ground. This was the mercy that had been promised in the verdict, but its execution at the stake created powerful symbolism. It appeared that even in death, Gilles' profound repentance had moved observers to acts of Christian charity. The message was clear. Even the worst sinner could achieve salvation through genuine contrition and confession. This served the Church's interest perfectly. It demonstrated that their system of confession, repentance, and absolution worked even for the most depraved criminals. But the theatrical mercy also served to legitimize the entire proceeding. If Gilles had been innocent, if the trial had been a political assassination, would noble ladies have intervened to save his body? Would the Church have allowed burial in consecrated ground? The answer the authorities wanted people to reach was no. The mercy shown to Gilles was presented as proof that he truly was guilty, but had achieved redemption through confession. It was the final act in a carefully staged performance. Henriette and Poitou received no such mercy. Their bodies were burned completely, their ashes scattered. The servants who had testified against their master were eliminated, ensuring they could never recant their confessions or reveal what had happened during their interrogations. Their deaths were necessary to maintain the integrity of the prosecution's case. Dead men couldn't contradict the official narrative. In the months following the execution, the legend of Gilles de Rais began to solidify. Preachers used his case as an example of how pride and sin could corrupt even heroes. Parents warned children about the dangers of strangers, using Gilles as a cautionary tale. The story was simplified, cleaned of its troubling ambiguities, transformed into a moral fable about a great man brought low by evil. Within a generation, Gilles de Rais had become synonymous with depravity, his name invoked whenever people wanted an example of human evil at its worst. But even in his own time, questions lingered. Some observers noted the absence of physical evidence. Others remarked on the suspicious coordination between the Duke of Brittany's political interests and the timing of the charges. A few chroniclers, writing years later, suggested that Gilles might have been the victim of a conspiracy. These doubts never coalesced into a coherent alternative narrative, but they persisted as whispers, as uneasy feelings that something about the official story didn't quite add up. The historical debate about Gilles de Rais has intensified over the past century as modern historians have applied more rigorous standards of evidence to medieval trials. Scholars like Gilbert Proutot and Mattei Cazacou have argued that Gilles was innocent, framed by political enemies who used the machinery of heresy prosecution to destroy him and seize his properties. They point to the lack of physical evidence, the reliance on tortured confessions, the suspicious coordination between courts, and the immediate redistribution of Gilles' estates to Duke Janvier's allies. Other historians maintain that Gilles' guilt is probable, arguing that medieval prosecutors, despite their problematic methods, rarely fabricated cases entirely. They note that child disappearances were reported in areas near Gilles' properties, that his interest in alchemy and occult studies is well documented, and that his confession included details that seemed to go beyond what prosecutors would have scripted. The debate continues, with no consensus emerging. What we can say with certainty is this. Gilles de Rais was convicted and executed based entirely on confessions extracted through psychological coercion and physical torture. No physical evidence of his alleged crimes was ever produced. The trial served the political and financial interests of powerful figures who stood to benefit from his removal. And the legal proceedings, while technically following medieval law, created a narrative that was unfalsifiable precisely because it explained away the absence of corroborating evidence. The case reveals something fundamental about medieval justice, and perhaps about justice systems in general. When powerful institutions decide someone needs to be eliminated, they can marshal the full force of legal procedure to produce that outcome. Confessions can be obtained through coercion that leaves no visible marks. Testimony can be shaped through interrogation techniques that create false memories. And the absence of physical evidence can be reframed as proof of how carefully crimes were concealed, rather than as reason to doubt whether crimes occurred. Gilles de Rais died maintaining his guilt, which, from a medieval perspective, was the proper ending. A sinner confessed, repented, and accepted just punishment while hoping for God's mercy. But from a modern perspective, his behavior at execution raises troubling questions. Why would a truly guilty man, facing death, maintain confessions that could no longer save him? Why not recant, die declaring innocence, at least plant seeds of doubt about the verdict? The fact that Gilles maintained his guilt to the end suggests either that he truly was guilty, or that he had been so thoroughly broken by the process that he genuinely believed he deserved death, or that he had calculated that maintaining his confession was the only path to salvation in the afterlife. 6 centuries later, we still don't know the truth about Gilles de Rais. Was he a serial killer who murdered over 100 children in satanic rituals? Or was he a politically vulnerable nobleman destroyed by a conspiracy that used the machinery of heresy prosecution to justify his elimination? The evidence is ambiguous enough that both interpretations remain possible. And perhaps that ambiguity is itself revealing about how medieval justice worked. The truth didn't matter as much as the narrative, and the narrative served the interests of power. What we do know is that on October 26, 1440, 3 men were executed in Nantes. 2 of them, Henriette Griard and Etienne Corriot, died after being tortured into confessing to crimes they may or may not have committed. The third, Gilles de Rais, died after confessing under threat of eternal damnation to crimes that left no physical evidence. Their executions served the political purposes of the Duke of Brittany, the religious purposes of the Bishop of Nantes, and the social purposes of a system that needed occasional public demonstrations of justice being done. The legend of Gilles de Rais would outlive him by centuries. He would inspire the fairy tale of Bluebeard, the aristocratic wife-killer who hid bodies in a locked room. He would become a stock figure in discussions of medieval depravity. His name would be invoked whenever people wanted an example of how power and privilege could corrupt absolutely. The real man, the one who fought alongside Joan of Arc, and spent himself into poverty on theatrical performances, that figure disappeared beneath the legend of the monster. Perhaps that was always the point. Medieval justice didn't just punish criminals. It created narratives that reinforced social and political order. Whether Gilles de Rais actually committed the crimes he confessed to matters less, from a medieval perspective, than the fact that his trial and execution demonstrated that even marshals of France could be brought to justice when they threatened the interests of dukes and bishops. The system worked, not by discovering truth, but by producing outcomes that served power. And so the question remains, 600 years later, debated by historians who will never have access to definitive proof. Was Gilles de Rais a monster? Or was he a monster made by monsters who understood how to use fear, torture, and the threat of eternal damnation to destroy anyone who stood in their way? The answer, perhaps, is that both things can be true, or that in a system designed to produce confessions regardless of guilt, the distinction between actual criminality and manufactured guilt becomes impossible to determine. The truth died with Gilles de Rais in that fire at the Prairie de la Madeleine. What survived was the legend, carefully crafted by prosecutors, validated by confessions obtained through methods that would make modern interrogators blush, and preserved for centuries as a warning about the depths of human evil. Whether that warning is about the evil of criminals or the evil of systems that create criminals to serve political purposes, that's a question each person must answer for themselves.